At what was supposed to be a quiet family gathering, my own brother stood up, smiled confidently, and began presenting my work as if it were his. Everyone nodded along. No one looked at me. I stayed silent, let him talk, let him click forward, until he realized the files weren't there. And as the room held its breath, I knew the next few minutes would change far more than just that meeting. Before I take you back to how it all started and why that moment mattered so much, do me a small favor, support the channel by subscribing and dropping a comment about where you're watching from. It helps these stories reach people who might need them more than they realize. My name is Eris Elmore, and for most of my life, I learned how to disappear in plain sight. It wasn't something anyone ever said out loud. No one announced that I was less important. It happened in smaller ways. In the way conversations shifted when I spoke. In the way credit slid sideways across the table until it landed in someone else's hands. In the way my ideas were praised only after they came out of my brother Caleb's mouth. The family gathering that set everything in motion took place at the Moore Hacienda in Redstone, New Mexico. On the surface, it was meant to be simple. Christmas week, a legacy meeting, a chance for the family to come together after my grandfather Edmund's passing and talk about the future of Moore Legacy Group. But in our family, simple was never honest. The air that evening was dry and warm in that desert way that makes your skin feel tight. I walked up the sandstone path toward the house, heels clicking softly, every step echoing with memories I hadn't invited back. The hacienda looked exactly as it always had. Arched doorways, heavy wooden beams, the same porch furniture arranged just so, waiting to be photographed but never truly used. Inside, the smell of citrus cleaner mixed with food that had been cooking too long. Voices floated through the house, laughter carefully measured, conversations already forming little circles that I would not be invited into. Eloan, my sister, spotted me first. She smiled quickly, the kind of smile that acknowledged my presence without welcoming it. "You made it," she said, already glancing past me. "Good. Tomorrow's going to be a big day." I nodded. "So I've heard." She hesitated, then added, "Mom sent out the agenda. Did you see it?" "I haven't opened it yet," I replied. Her smile tightened just for a second. "Oh, well, Caleb's presenting the operations overview. It made sense given everything." Everything. That word carried weight in our family. It meant decisions had already been made without me. Later that night, alone in the West Wing guest room, I finally opened the email. The subject line read, "Updated Family Planning Agenda." My eyes skimmed down the list of speakers, once, then again. Caleb Moore, Strategic Operations Presentation. Eloan Moore, Brand Alignment. Thomas Moore, Vision and Continuity. My name wasn't there. Not as a presenter. Not as a contributor. Not even in the acknowledgments. I stared at the screen, feeling something inside me settle rather than rise. It wasn't anger. Anger requires surprise. This felt like confirmation. At dinner, I was seated at the far end of the long table, just close enough to be included, just far enough to be ignored. Plates clinked. Glasses were raised. Compliments were exchanged freely, just never in my direction. Caleb was in rare form, charming, relaxed, already speaking as if the meeting tomorrow were his stage. He talked about efficiency, about systems, about vision. Words I had spent months turning into something real. When I tried to add a comment about supply chain optimization, my mother cut in mid-sentence. "Caleb, tell your uncle about the vendor expansion idea you mentioned earlier." And just like that, my voice vanished again. That night, I didn't sleep much. The ceiling fan spun lazily above me as memories stacked up, one after another. Times I had stepped back for the good of the family. Times I had been told I was better behind the scenes. Times I had been praised privately but erased publicly. Sometime after midnight, I got up. The archive room sat at the end of the hall, converted years ago from my grandfather's office. I opened the cabinet drawers quietly, careful not to disturb anything. Inside were stacks of printed proposals. My proposals. Every single one was blank. Not misprinted. Not unfinished. Replaced. The header still carried my name. But the content, the data, the models, the forecasts had been stripped clean. When I checked the printer log, my stomach went cold. The files had been accessed earlier that day. From Eloan's laptop. That was the moment I stopped, wondering if this was intentional. Back in my room, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I opened my laptop and created 2 versions of my project. One was the real one, complete, encrypted, backed up in places no one else knew existed. The other looked perfect on the surface. Polished slides, confident charts, empty underneath. I placed the hollow version exactly where Caleb would find it. Morning came, quietly. In the kitchen, I watched Caleb rehearse, standing confidently in front of the television, clicking through slides he didn't understand. He spoke in smooth phrases, gesturing like someone who believed the spotlight belonged to him. No one questioned it. No one looked at me. By the time the family gathered in the Heritage Boardroom, I had already accepted something important. I wasn't here to fight for recognition. I was here to stop being erased. When Caleb stood up and began his presentation, the room leaned in. He spoke confidently. He smiled. He clicked forward. Nothing appeared. He clicked again. Still nothing. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. I stayed seated, calm, watching. And as confusion began to ripple across the room, I knew this was only the beginning. The silence in the Heritage Boardroom didn't break right away. It stretched, thick and uncomfortable, the kind that makes people shift in their seats without knowing why. Caleb stood frozen at the front of the room, remote in his hand, clicking again as if repetition might summon something that simply wasn't there. "Just a second," he said with a laugh that landed flat. "Looks like the file didn't load." My father leaned forward, slightly. "Do you have a backup?" Caleb's jaw tightened. He glanced down at his laptop, fingers moving faster now, no longer confident, just searching. The screen stayed stubbornly blank except for a single line of text centered in oversized font. "Good luck." Someone cleared their throat. Another person coughed, too loud, too forced. I felt eyes begin to drift toward me, not all at once, but in small, uncertain glances. People were trying to remember when I'd stopped being invisible. Eloan shifted beside her mother, her smile tightening the way it always did when something went off script. "Maybe the IT folder synced wrong," she said quickly. "You know how these systems can be." Caleb nodded too fast. "Yes, exactly. I'll just..." He unplugged the cable, plugged it back in. Still nothing. I stayed where I was, hands folded calmly in my lap. My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. I'd imagined this moment before, but I'd expected anger, maybe even fear. Instead, there was a strange stillness inside me, like a room after the lights go out. One of my uncles leaned back in his chair. "Caleb," he said slowly, "you mentioned predictive modeling in your outline. Where's that section?" Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "It's further in the deck." "There is no deck," someone else murmured. That was when I stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to draw attention without demanding it. "I have the complete version," I said quietly. Every head turned. Caleb looked at me then, really looked at me, his expression flickering between disbelief and something darker. Eloan's hand tightened around her pen. "I didn't realize you were involved," my father said carefully. I met his gaze. "That's because I wasn't supposed to be." I walked to the front of the room and placed a slim folder on the table. Inside were printed timelines, source data, version histories, and original notes in my handwriting. I didn't rush. I didn't explain yet. I let them see it. "This project didn't disappear," I continued. "It was removed." Caleb let out a short laugh. "That's not fair, Araceli. You're misunderstanding." The file you accessed last night, I said calmly, wasn't the final one. The room went very quiet. My cousin Ria, who had avoided eye contact with me for years, frowned slightly. What do you mean, removed? I turned one of the documents toward her. This is the original model, time-stamped, backed up. The version Caleb opened this morning was incomplete by design. My mother inhaled sharply. Why would you do that? I looked at her, really looked at her, because I was erased. No one interrupted me this time. For months, I went on, I worked on this framework. Not as an assistant, not as support, as the architect. When I saw my name missing from the agenda, I checked the files. They'd been stripped. So I created two versions. One real, one empty. Caleb's face had gone pale. You set me up. I tilted my head slightly. No, I let you walk in with what you chose to take. That landed differently. My father rubbed his temples. This is getting out of hand. Only because it's finally visible, I replied. The meeting dissolved after that. Not officially, but emotionally. Conversations splintered. People stood, shuffled papers, whispered behind hands. No one asked Caleb to continue. I left the room first. In the hallway, sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across framed family photos. I stopped in front of one I'd noticed 100 times before. A group shot from a company anniversary. Everyone centered perfectly except me. My face half-cropped. My presence reduced to a shoulder and a smile without eyes. I didn't fix the frame this time. Behind me, footsteps approached. Eloan. You didn't have to humiliate him, she said quietly. I turned. You didn't have to erase me. Her mouth opened, then closed again. You could have talked to us. I did, said. For years. You just weren't listening. She crossed her arms. You always take things personally. I smiled faintly. Only when they're personal. She watched me for a moment, then shook her head. You've complicated things. No, I said. I clarified them. That night, I packed my suitcase without ceremony. I left the guest room exactly as I'd found it, floral bedding smoothed, nothing out of place. I wasn't angry enough to leave mess behind. I was finished enough not to care. The next morning, I woke early and left before anyone else stirred. The desert air was cool, the sky just beginning to pale. I didn't look back at the hacienda as I drove away. By noon, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Is this Araceli Moore? A voice asked when I answered. Yes. This is Jonah Whitlock. We've worked together before through your grandfather. I pulled over, suddenly alert. Yes, I remember. I saw the agenda for yesterday's meeting, he said carefully. Your name wasn't on it. I exhaled slowly. That's correct. I thought so, he replied. Because the model Caleb attempted to present, that's yours. I've seen early versions. You sent them to me last year. Something settled in my chest. Thank you for saying that. I wanted to make sure you weren't blindsided, he continued. And to be honest, I wanted to know if you'd still be involved moving forward. I smiled for the first time that day. I will be. After I hung up, I sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, realizing something important. The silence I'd endured for years wasn't universal. It had just been contained. By the time I reached Solara City, messages were already stacking up. Old colleagues, vendors, people who had worked with my grandfather and wondered quietly why my name had faded from conversations. Caleb, I noticed, wasn't among them. That evening, Eloan posted a smiling photo on social media. Family first, the caption read. Sometimes things get misunderstood, but love remains. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and began organizing everything I'd saved over the years. Not for confrontation. For clarity. Files. Emails. Notes. Versions. A clean timeline. If this was going to move forward, it would be on record. Because the truth I was learning didn't need volume. It needed structure. And somewhere between the empty presentation and the quiet drive away, I realized this wasn't about a meeting at all. It was about what happens when the person in the background finally steps out of frame and refuses to disappear again. By the time I reached my apartment in Solar City that night, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind something quieter and heavier. Not regret, not fear, just the awareness that a door had closed, whether my family wanted to acknowledge it or not. I set my bag down by the door and stood in the dim living room for a long moment without turning on the lights. The city hummed outside, distant traffic, the low buzz of neon signs and late-night diners. This space was mine. No legacy furniture. No inherited expectations. Just clean lines, unfinished sketches on the wall, and a desk cluttered with ideas no one else had touched. I poured myself a glass of water and finally checked my phone properly. 12 missed messages, 5 emails, 3 voicemails. Most of them followed the same pattern. I didn't know you were that involved. Why didn't you say something sooner? We assumed Caleb was leading. Assumed. The word kept repeating, echoing louder than any accusation. One message stood out. It was from Marla Chin, an old colleague from my Seattle days. We hadn't spoken in years, not since she'd moved firms and I'd quietly stepped back from consulting. I heard about the meeting. Her message read, "Small world. Just wanted to say, you're not imagining this. Caleb pitched something very similar at our firm last year. Claimed it was his. It unraveled when we asked for the underlying data. He left shortly after." I stared at the screen, the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't new behavior. It was a pattern. And I wasn't the first person he'd tried it on. I'd just been the most convenient. I typed back a simple thank you and set the phone down. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, memories surfaced uninvited. Moments I'd dismissed at the time because acknowledging them felt like admitting I didn't belong. The community business gala 2 years ago, when my name had been printed on the program as a speaker, then quietly replaced. My mother's hand on my arm that night, gentle but firm. Let Caleb do it. People listened to him. The late nights, I'd stayed up helping Aloan refine proposals she'd later present as our family's vision. The way praise always seemed to land one seat to my left. I had called it compromise, maturity, being the bigger person. What it really was, I realized now, was training. The next morning, I woke early and opened my laptop with a different mindset. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was documenting. I created a folder labeled Archive, Originals, and began pulling everything into it. Drafts, metadata, version histories, emails confirming receipt of files, even casual messages where Caleb had thanked me for helping him think through certain sections. Each file was dated, each edit traceable. I worked for hours, methodical, precise, not angry, focused. Around noon, there was a knock at my door. I didn't expect visitors, so my first instinct was caution. When I opened it, I was surprised to see Rhea standing there, hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, eyes uncertain. "I hope this is okay," she said. "I was in town." I stepped aside. "Come in." She sat at the edge of the couch, glancing around like she wasn't sure where to put her hands. "I didn't say anything yesterday," she began. "I should have." I nodded. "You're not the only one." She winced. "That doesn't make it better." "No," I agreed, "but it makes it honest." She hesitated. "You know they're trying to contain this, right?" I smiled faintly. "They always do." Aloan's telling people it was a misunderstanding, that emotions were high. "And Caleb?" I asked. Rhea shook her head. "He hasn't said much, but he's angry, not embarrassed. Angry." That didn't surprise me. Before she left, Rhea paused at the door. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "watching you yesterday, it made a lot of things make sense." After she left, I returned to my desk and kept working. That afternoon, my attorney, Sloane Parker, called me back. "I reviewed what you sent," she said. "You're covered. The documentation is clean. If you want to formalize ownership or take steps to protect your work going forward, we can do that immediately." "I do," I said without hesitation. We scheduled a meeting for the next morning. By evening, the narrative online had shifted slightly. Caleb posted a polished video on his professional profile, standing in front of a bookshelf he'd clearly staged for effect. "I regret the confusion surrounding recent events," he said smoothly. "There were miscommunications within the family, and I take responsibility for how that unfolded." He never said my name. The comments were split. Some praised his humility. Others questioned the vagueness. Eloan shared it with a caption about unity and moving forward. I didn't engage. Instead, I posted one photo. It was an old one, taken in my grandfather Edmund's garage. We were both laughing, grease on our hands. The original sketch of the logistics framework spread out on the workbench between us. My caption was simple: "Some things don't need rebranding." Within an hour, messages poured in. Former employees, old partners, people who had worked under Edmund and remembered, who stayed late and who actually built the systems everyone depended on. One message came from a journalist I'd never met. "I'm covering a piece on family-owned businesses and succession challenges. Would you be open to talking?" I didn't reply right away. I wasn't ready to speak publicly. Not yet. The following day, I met Sloane in her office. We went through everything line by line. She nodded, impressed, as I laid out the timeline. "You anticipated this," she said. "I didn't want to," I replied. "But I did." By the time I left, the paperwork was underway. My work was protected. My role formalized. Not within more legacy group, but separate from it. That was intentional. I didn't want to fight for a seat at a table that had been built to keep me standing. That evening, my mother called. I let it ring twice before answering. "Araceli," she said, "we need to talk." "About what?" I asked calmly. "This has gone far enough," she replied. "People are asking questions." I smiled to myself. They should. There was a pause. "You've embarrassed your brother." I closed my eyes briefly. "No, he embarrassed himself." "You could have handled this privately," she insisted. "I tried," I said. "For years." Her voice softened. "You know how he is." "Yes," I replied. "Now everyone else does too." When the call ended, I felt lighter. Not victorious. Free. Late that night, I stood by the window, city lights stretching out beneath me, and thought about something Edmund once told me. Legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what survives when people try to take it from you. I didn't know yet how the next chapter would unfold. I only knew this. They had built their version of the story without me, and now I was writing mine where they couldn't edit it. When I woke the next morning, the first thing I noticed was how quiet my phone was. No frantic messages. No family group chat blowing up with half apologies wrapped in defensiveness. Just silence. That silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. I dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing clothes the way I always did when something mattered. Not to impress, not to prove anything, but to remind myself who I was before anyone tried to define me. The mirror reflected a woman who looked calmer than she felt, steadier than she'd been in years. By the time I reached Sloane's office again, later that week, the shift had already begun. She slid a folder across the desk. "Your filings are complete. Ownership, authorship, and usage rights are now legally separate. Clean break." I opened it, scanning my name printed clearly, unmistakably where should have been all along. No footnotes. No asterisks. No one standing in front of it. "Good," said. She studied me for a moment. "Most people wait for an apology before they do this." "I waited long enough," I replied. Outside, Solara City moved the way it always did, fast, indifferent, alive. But something inside me had slowed, settled. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. That afternoon, The first official consequence landed. A vendor I'd worked with for years, one my family considered secured, called me directly. "We've paused collaboration with More Legacy," he said carefully. "Not terminating. Just reassessing." I didn't ask why. He didn't need to explain. The next day, another followed. Then another. Not dramatic exits. Just quiet hesitations. Delayed meetings. Requests for clarification that had never been asked before. People weren't choosing sides. They were choosing certainty. And suddenly, the certainty wasn't where my family had assumed it would always be. I found out through Rhea, who called late that night, voice tight, that Caleb had been pulled into an emergency board session. "He didn't tell them you'd built the framework," she said. "He told them you'd assisted." I laughed once softly. "Of course he did." "They asked for proof," she added. I pictured that room, the polished table, the leather chairs, the confidence he usually wore like armor, and imagined him reaching for files that didn't belong to him anymore. "Did he have it?" I asked. Rhea didn't answer immediately. "No," she finally said. The silence, after that, felt different. Less heavy. More inevitable. By the weekend, my mother showed up at my apartment. She didn't call first. I opened the door and found her standing there with her purse clutched too tightly, eyes scanning the hallway like she was already calculating how this visit would be perceived. "May I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. She sat on the couch like a guest, not a parent, like someone who wasn't sure where they stood anymore. "You've made things difficult," she said after a moment. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely. "No. I made them accurate." She frowned. "That's not how family works." "That's exactly how it works," I replied. "You just don't like seeing it." Her gaze moved around the apartment, my books, my notes, the framed sketch I'd finally hung on the wall. "You never told us you were doing all this," she said. I tilted my head. "You never asked." Her mouth opened, then closed. "You should have trusted us," she tried. I met her eyes. I did. "That's how we got here." She stood abruptly, smoothing her jacket like the conversation had physically wrinkled it. "This isn't over," she said. I nodded. "I know." After she left, I sat on the floor for a long time, back against the couch, breathing through the strange mix of grief and relief that comes when you finally stop hoping someone will change. The following week, the article ran. Not sensational. Not cruel, just factual. It outlined the history of More Legacy's logistics expansion, traced its origins back further than most people realized, and, without accusing anyone, highlighted discrepancies between public credit and documented development. My name appeared exactly once. That was enough. The calls started after that. Old partners, new firms, quiet inquiries framed as curiosity. "What are you building now? Are you open to collaboration? Would you consider leading this independently?" I said no more than yes. I listened more than I spoke. Meanwhile, inside my family, things unraveled slowly. Caleb stopped posting. Eloan went quiet online. Group dinners were postponed until things settled. Nothing was settling. One evening, I received a message from my father. "We should talk." I stared at it for a long time before replying. "Okay." We met at a neutral place, a cafe neither of us loved enough to claim. He looked older than I remembered. Not frail, just tired in a way I hadn't seen before. "You didn't have to humiliate him," he said without preamble. I wrapped my hands around my cup. "I didn't humiliate him." "He's struggling," my father continued. "People are questioning his competence." I finally looked up. "Because they should." He exhaled sharply. "You're enjoying this?" I shook my head. "No. I'm done surviving it." There was a long pause. "You always wanted approval," he said quietly. I smiled, small and sad. "I wanted acknowledgement. There's a difference." He studied me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time and realizing how much he'd missed. "What do you want now?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. "I want distance," I said finally. And honesty, even if it's uncomfortable. He nodded once. That may take time. I know, I replied. Take it. That night, alone again, I opened my notebook and wrote something I'd been circling for years. I am not invisible. I was ignored. The difference mattered. The final confirmation came quietly, the way real shifts always do. An email from the board. After careful review, we've decided to restructure leadership on the logistics initiative. Caleb's name was no longer attached. Mine wasn't either. And that was fine, because I wasn't waiting to be reinstated. I was already building something that didn't require their permission. As I closed my laptop, the city lights flickered outside, and a thought settled deep and steady in my chest. They thought silence meant weakness. They never learned what it looks like when silence decides to stand up. The morning after that email, I woke before sunrise. Not from anxiety, from clarity. The kind that doesn't rush you out of bed, but pulls you up gently, like something inside has already decided what the day will become. I brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching the city stretch awake. Delivery trucks humming, streetlights clicking off one by one. The ordinary mechanics of a world that doesn't pause just because your life has quietly pivoted. That was the thing I'd finally understood. Nothing ends with fireworks. It ends with alignment. By mid-morning, my inbox carried a different tone entirely. Not curiosity now, commitment. A mid-sized firm I'd consulted for years. One that had always routed contracts through my brother for efficiency, sent a direct proposal addressed solely to me. Another asked if I'd consider an advisory role with full autonomy. No legacy branding. No family optics. Just work, clean and honest. I didn't respond immediately. I went for a walk instead. There was a small park 3 blocks from my apartment, overlooked and mostly empty on weekdays. I sat on a bench beneath a jacaranda tree and let the purple petals fall where they may. For years, I'd mistaken endurance for strength. Staying, swallowing, waiting to be chosen. But strength, I realized, was choosing yourself before bitterness had time to rot you from the inside. That afternoon, Aloan called. I let it ring twice before answering. You didn't warn us, she said. No greeting. No warmth. I didn't plan to, I replied. You let Caleb walk into that meeting without files, she accused. I closed my eyes briefly. I let him walk in with what he brought. That was cruel. No, I said evenly. That was accurate. Her voice wavered. You could have stopped him. You could have stopped him long before I had to. Silence pressed in. You've changed, she finally said. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. I've stopped shrinking. She hung up without saying goodbye. That evening, a mutual acquaintance sent me a screenshot. Caleb's professional profile had been updated. Title removed. Description softened. Achievements rewritten in vague language that said everything without proving anything. It was the digital equivalent of a man standing in an empty room, insisting he'd built it. I didn't forward it, didn't comment, didn't react, because something else had begun. 2 weeks later, I signed papers for a small studio space, nothing glamorous. Exposed brick, large windows, a place where ideas could breathe without asking permission. The lease was in my name alone. On the first day, I unlocked the door. Dust motes swirled in the sunlight like they'd been waiting. I stood in the center of the room and let the quiet settle. This was not an office built from inheritance or expectation. It was built from intention. Ria came by with pastries and a grin that said she'd been holding on to good news. They're restructuring more than you think, she said, dropping into a chair. The board's nervous. Vendors are demanding transparency. They're realizing how much depended on you. I shrugged lightly. It always did. You could go back, she added. On your terms. I considered it, then shook my head. I don't want a seat at a table that keeps moving my chair. She raised her cup. To building your own. I clinked mine against it. Word traveled the way truth always does, not loudly but persistently. I was invited to panels. asked to review frameworks, consulted quietly by people who'd once pretended not to know my name. And then, inevitably, the apology attempts came. Not apologies, really. Rebrands. My mother sent a message asking if we could reset. My father suggested dinner as professionals. Even Caleb tried once, an email framed as collaboration. I deleted it, because collaboration requires respect, not desperation. The final conversation happened unexpectedly, at a charity gala I hadn't planned to attend. I'd gone for the cause, not the crowd. Slipped in late, intended to leave early. But as I stood near the back, glass in hand, I felt a presence beside me. Caleb. He looked thinner. Not broken, just stripped of certainty. You've made a name for yourself, he said. I always had one, I replied calmly. He exhaled. You didn't have to do it this way. I turned to face him fully. You didn't have to do it at all. His jaw tightened. You enjoyed watching me fail. I met his eyes, steady. No, I enjoyed watching the truth survive without me protecting it. He swallowed. We could have been unstoppable together. I considered that for a moment. Only if I stayed invisible, I said. That was never partnership. He looked away first. As I walked out into the night air, the city lights reflected off glass and metal. Sharper now, clearer. I felt no triumph, no bitterness, just space. Space to build, space to speak, space to exist without explanation. Back in my studio the next morning, I pinned the first concept sketch to the wall. No logo, no branding, just an idea in its rawest form. Under it, I wrote one sentence. Credit doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the one who stays when no one's watching. I stepped back and smiled, because somewhere behind me, quietly, inevitably, the door I'd once been pushed out of was closing. And this time, I was the one holding the key. The third email arrived just after midnight. No subject line, no greeting, just a forwarded calendar invite. Emergency executive review. Attendance mandatory. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I was surprised, but because of who was copied. Names that hadn't appeared together in years. People who never moved unless something underneath them had cracked. Caleb hadn't asked for this meeting. He couldn't. Someone else had. I didn't accept the invite. I didn't decline it either. I closed my laptop and let the dark room settle around me, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. Somewhere across town, people were scrambling, calling favors, rewriting timelines, trying to decide which version of the story would hurt least if it became permanent. By morning, my phone buzzed nonstop. Unknown numbers, old contacts, one voicemail after another left without messages, like the act of calling itself might somehow register as effort. I ignored them all. Instead, I drove. There was a storage unit on the east side I hadn't visited in years. Climate-controlled, nondescript, the kind of place that held things people didn't want to look at but weren't ready to destroy. I parked, entered the code, walked down the long concrete hallway until I reached the last unit on the right. Inside were boxes, neatly labeled, dates, project names, receipts of memory. I pulled one out at random and opened it on the floor. Old notebooks, handwritten drafts, printouts with margin notes that never made it into final decks. And at the bottom, a flash drive taped to the spine of a folder. I hadn't touched it since before everything went wrong. I slid it into my laptop. The folder structure opened instantly, familiar as muscle memory. Version histories, authorship logs, edits time-stamped late at night when no one else was watching. Comments Caleb had once left before deleting them. The kind of fingerprints people forget, computers never erase. I copied the entire directory to a secure cloud vault. Then I closed the laptop. Because the next move wasn't digital. It was public. That afternoon, a mutual acquaintance texted me. They're saying you sabotaged him. I didn't respond. Another followed. They're claiming the files were corrupted. That you knew and stayed quiet. Still nothing. Then a third. Board split. Someone leaked audio. Not sure whose. That one made my fingers pause. Audio. I replied with a single word. What audio? 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Haven't heard it yet. Just that it exists. I exhaled slowly. Caleb was sloppy when he thought he was safe. Always had been. I spent the evening doing nothing that looked like preparation. I cooked. Cleaned. Let the mundane ground me while the storm gathered elsewhere. Control doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like stillness while everyone else overcorrects. At 9:17 p.m., my doorbell rang. I didn't answer. A knock followed. Firmer. More deliberate. Please, a voice said through the door. We just need to talk. Eloan. I waited long enough for the silence to stretch, then longer. Finally, I opened the door halfway. She looked different. Not composed. Not rehearsed. Her hair wasn't perfect. Her confidence was thinner, stretched too tight. You didn't come to the meeting, she said. I wasn't invited as myself, I replied. She swallowed. They're saying you engineered this. I didn't engineer anything, I said calmly. I stopped covering. Her eyes flicked past me, like she expected proof to be visible in my apartment. They're panicking, she admitted. The board wants answers. Investors are asking why Caleb can't reproduce his own work. I tilted my head. Can he? She didn't answer. That's what I thought. Her voice dropped. We could still fix this. That word again. Fix. You want me to help him lie better, I said. She flinched. You want him ruined. No, I said. I want him accurate. Silence sat between us, heavy and awkward. Finally, she said, they're digging into past projects. I met her eyes fully now. They shid. You don't understand what this could expose. I understand exactly, I said. That's why I stopped stopping it. She looked at me like she was seeing something unfamiliar. You're not angry, she said slowly. No, I agreed. That scares you. She left without another word. The next morning, headlines began to shift. Not accusations. Questions. The most dangerous kind. Discrepancies in authorship surface at legacy firm. Internal review raises concerns over presentation integrity. Former contributor declines comment amid escalating scrutiny. I declined comment because silence was doing the work for me. At noon, an email landed from a law firm I recognized. We represent Mr. Calderon. Please advise your availability. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded it to my attorney with a single line. They've noticed. By evening, the audio leaks surfaced. It wasn't dramatic. That's what made it lethal. Caleb's voice. Casual. Confident. Laughing. You don't need her there, he said. She builds. I deliver. Nobody asks who laid the bricks once the house looks good. The clip cut off. No commentary. No framing. Just truth, raw and unpolished. The internet did the rest. I watched none of it. I already knew what would happen when people finally saw the scaffolding behind the facade. My phone buzzed once more. Unknown number. I answered this time. You win, a man's voice said. I recognized him immediately. Board chair. I didn't compete, I replied. A pause. What do you want? I looked out the window at the city. Lights blinking on as night crept in. I want my name back, I said. And I want distance. How much? I smiled faintly. That question, I said, is why this keeps happening. Another pause. Longer. Then, quietly, we need you. I let the silence stretch, just enough to remind him what need feels like. Then I said, I'll let you know. And I hung up. Behind me, my laptop chimed softly. A new message. No sender name. Just a file attachment. Audio_full_uncut.mp3. I stared at the screen. Heart steady, instinct sharp. because whatever was on that file hadn't surfaced by accident, and whoever sent it wasn't helping Caleb. They were helping the truth finish what it had started. I didn't open the file right away. That was the mistake people always made, thinking urgency meant speed. In my experience, urgency meant precision. Whoever sent the audio wanted a reaction, wanted me to move fast, stumble, expose myself. I let the file sit. Instead, I called my attorney. "Something just landed," I said. "Uncut audio. Possibly illegal, definitely damaging." She didn't ask who. She already knew. "Do not open it on a personal device," she said. "Forward it. I'll have my team authenticate the metadata before you even listen." I forwarded the file and powered my phone down. For the first time in days, the silence felt deliberate. By morning, the city had shifted again. It always did after the truth surfaced. People didn't wake up angry. They woke up cautious. Emails were shorter. Calls more careful. The kind of restraint that comes when everyone realizes the ground under them isn't as solid as they thought. My building's lobby TV played a business channel quietly in background as I grabbed my mail. Internal audit expanding scope. Questions raised about intellectual ownership. Sources confirm additional materials may emerge. I kept my head down and walked past just another tenant with a tote bag and unread mail. But upstairs, my inbox told a different story. Requests weren't phrased as favors anymore. They were framed as acknowledgments. "We'd like to formally recognize your contributions. We believe there may have been an oversight regarding authorship. We are revisiting prior attributions and would value your input. Input, not permission, not silence." They were circling, trying to decide which way to lean without being the first to fall. At 10:04 a.m., my attorney called back. "It's real," she said. "Not just one recording. There are 3. Different dates. Different locations. All consistent." I closed my eyes. "Anything actionable?" "Yes," she replied. "And something else." I waited. "One of them isn't about you," she said carefully. "At least not directly." That got my attention. It's Caleb, talking to a client, admitting he reused proprietary frameworks from a previous firm, naming names. My jaw tightened. How bad? Bad enough that if it goes public, the current situation becomes the least of his problems. I didn't respond immediately, because this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about trajectory. Who sent it? I asked. "We're tracing it," she said, but it didn't come from inside the board, meaning someone else had decided the silence was no longer worth keeping. By noon, Caleb's profile vanished. Not updated. Not revised. Gone. Deleted links. Broken embeds. Dead references where his name used to live. People noticed. Screenshots circulated. Speculation bloomed. That afternoon, I received a message I didn't expect. From my mother. No subject line. Just a sentence. "We need to talk." I stared at it longer than the others. Not because it mattered more. Because it had always mattered differently. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked. There was a cafe I used to go to years ago, back when my work was still referred to as helping out. I sat by the window with a notebook and watched strangers pass, each of them carrying lives that had nothing to do with my family's implosion. I wrote one line at the top of the page. What happens if I say nothing? Then I waited. The answer came sooner than expected. At 3:17 p.m., a press inquiry hit my inbox. "We are preparing a feature on systemic credit misattribution in family-run enterprises. Your name has surfaced repeatedly. Would you be willing to speak on background?" Background. Not attribution. Not headline. They were offering me the space to shape the narrative without owning the fallout. I didn't respond. At 3:42, another message arrived. Different outlet. Same question. At 4:10, my attorney forwarded a draft statement the board was circulating internally. It used phrases like collective oversight, and unintentional gaps, and moving forward with transparency. My name appeared once, as a contributor, not an architect. I laughed, out loud. The sound surprised me. They were still trying to manage the story instead of acknowledging it. That meant they hadn't learned, which meant this wasn't over. The next call came from an unfamiliar number. I answered. Ms. LaRue, a man said. This is internal compliance. We're conducting an independent review. We'd like to ask you some questions. Am I required to participate? I asked calmly. No, he admitted, but your cooperation would be noted. I smiled to myself. I'll submit documentation, I said, not commentary. That would be helpful. I ended the call and opened the secure vault. Folders bloomed across the screen like a map of time. Each file named, dated, logged. I didn't cherry pick. I exported everything. The real work. The drafts. The versions Caleb never saw. The comments he'd deleted. The night timestamps. The authorship metadata that doesn't care who's charming. I sent it as a single compressed archive. No message. No explanation. Just evidence. That evening, my mother called again. This time I answered. Her voice sounded smaller. You've embarrassed the family, she said. I didn't react. You could have handled this privately. I tried, I said. You didn't try hard enough. I inhaled slowly. No, I corrected. I stopped trying alone. Silence stretched. Then, softer. They're saying you orchestrated this. I closed my eyes. I didn't, I said. I stepped back. And everything collapsed. Yes, I agreed. That should tell you something. She didn't respond. I hung up gently. That night, I finally listened to the full audio. Not because I needed proof. Because I wanted to know who else had been harmed in the shadows. The recordings were worse than I expected. Not malicious. Casual. That was the part that stayed with me. The way Caleb spoke about people like resources. Replaceable. Interchangeable. Useful until they weren't. And in one clip, unmistakably he said my name. She's brilliant, he said, but she won't fight. She wants peace. I paused the audio. Sat back. Let that sentence echo. He had mistaken my silence for consent. My patience for weakness. My restraint for fear. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. A storm forming, slow and heavy. By the time the doors of the conference center closed behind me, the afternoon sun had shifted, casting long, sharp shadows across the parking lot. The air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just altered, like something fundamental had moved and couldn't be put back where it was. I didn't rush to my car. I stood there for a moment, listening to the distant hum of traffic, grounding myself in the quiet that followed a public unraveling. Inside that building, conversations were still happening without me. Voices lowered, names spoken carefully, versions of the story already forming. I knew how this worked. By tonight, people would be choosing where they stood. Not loudly, not with declarations, but with invitations not sent, calls not returned, glances avoided. That was fine. I had stopped needing to be chosen. My phone buzzed once. Then again. I didn't look at it yet. I wanted one moment that belonged only to me, untouched by explanations or reactions. I unlocked the car, set my bag on the passenger seat, and finally checked the screen. Missed calls. Texts. A voicemail from my mother I didn't open. A message from Vera that said only we need to talk. No punctuation. No apology. Just the expectation that I would still come when summoned. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove. Not home. Not back to the house that had never quite felt like mine. I drove toward the industrial strip on the edge of town, where warehouses sat half-renovated and overlooked, where projects either died quietly or became something real because no one was watching closely enough to interfere. I pulled into a gravel lot and parked in front of the building I'd signed papers for 2 weeks earlier, just in case. The timing hadn't been planned. It rarely is. Inside, the space smelled like dust and fresh paint. Concrete floors, high ceilings, sunlight pouring in through long, narrow windows. It wasn't impressive yet, but it was honest. I walked the perimeter slowly, my heels echoing, imagining where desks would go, where whiteboards would hang, where ideas would be built without being handed off to someone else for approval. Another buzz. This time I looked. A message from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Martin Hale. I was in the room today. If you're open to it, I'd like to discuss next steps on your terms." I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Martin Hale didn't reach out casually. He didn't reach out unless something had shifted enough to make ignoring it impossible. I typed back a single sentence. "Tomorrow. Morning. Here." No explanation. No pitch. Just coordinates. I put the phone away and exhaled slowly. The thing about being underestimated for so long is that people assume your silence means absence. They never consider that you might be building something parallel, something quiet, something that doesn't need their permission to exist. They don't see the groundwork until they're standing on it and wondering how it got there. That evening, the fallout began exactly the way I expected it to. The group chat exploded, concern disguised as confusion, confusion disguised as blame. Someone asked why things had gone so far. Someone else suggested we all take a pause and remember we were family. No one asked why the theft happened. No one asked why I hadn't been listed, credited, acknowledged. The problem to them was never the act. It was the exposure. I muted the thread. Later, a knock came at my apartment door. I didn't open it at first. I watched through the peephole as my mother stood there, arms folded, posture rigid, like she was bracing for resistance she didn't think she should have to face. When I finally opened the door, she didn't step inside. "You embarrassed us," she said quietly, as if volume was the issue. I met her gaze. No, I stopped letting it happen quietly. Her jaw tightened. "You could have handled it privately." "I tried," I replied. "For years." She looked past me into the apartment, taking in the neatness, the packed boxes near the wall, the sense that I was already halfway gone. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle her. "What do you want now?" she asked. The question hung between us, heavy with old assumptions. "I want space," I said, "and I'm taking it whether it's granted or not." She didn't argue. She just nodded once, sharp and contained, then turned and walked away. No hug, no closing words, just the quiet acknowledgement that something had slipped beyond her ability to manage. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. In the morning, Martin arrived precisely on time. He walked the space with a careful eye, asked thoughtful questions, didn't interrupt when I explained the framework I'd built, the systems I designed, the safeguards I'd learned to put in place after watching my work walk away from me one too many times. When I finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then he smiled, not wide, not performative, just enough to signal respect. "They built their house on your foundation," he said, "and they assumed you'd never ask for it back." "I'm not asking," I replied. He nodded. "Good, because what I'm offering isn't restitution. It's expansion." We shook hands. After he left, I sat alone in the center of the room, the echo of possibility still vibrating in the air. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that anything had changed. Inside, everything had. By the afternoon, the first official email went out, quiet, precise, addressed to people who mattered. By evening, replies began arriving. Curious, interested, careful, the kind of attention that isn't loud, but lasts. And somewhere across town, I knew my brother was starting to realize that the room he thought he controlled had shifted, and that the silence he'd counted on was no longer empty. It was waiting. The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the messages or the missed calls. It was the quiet, the kind that doesn't feel empty, but deliberate, like a held breath before something irreversible. Sunlight slid across the floor of my apartment, touching the edge of a cardboard box labeled Only Archive, the one I'd packed months ago without knowing why. I stood there for a moment, barefoot, coffee cooling in my hand, and understood that whatever came next would not be undone. By noon, the quiet cracked. It started with a call from an unfamiliar number I almost ignored. When I answered, the voice on the other end was professional, careful, but unmistakably unsettled. He introduced himself as a compliance officer, neutral title, neutral tone, and asked if I had a few minutes to confirm authorship on a set of documents currently under internal review. He didn't say my brother's name. He didn't have to. I told him I did. I always had time for the truth. As I spoke, I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I described dates, versions, access logs, the way you would explain weather patterns to someone who finally realized the storm hadn't appeared out of nowhere. When the call ended, he thanked me twice. The second time sounded different, like someone realizing the floor beneath them had shifted and they were already mid-step. An hour later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my brother. His message was short. We need to talk. Now. I stared at it for a long time. The urgency wasn't new. What was new was the absence of confidence. For years, his words had always assumed an outcome. Compliance, silence, my eventual retreat. This time, the assumption was gone. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and sent a single email to the board liaison Martin had introduced me to the day before. No subject, line theatrics. No narrative. Just the files. The real ones. Metadata intact. Timelines unbroken. Ownership unmistakable. When you've been erased carefully, you learn how to document yourself even more carefully. By late afternoon, the family group chat went quiet. Not muted, quiet. No typing bubbles. No, let's calm down. Silence like a room where everyone has suddenly realized they've been saying the wrong thing for years and don't know how to correct it without admitting they knew better all along. At 6, there was a knock at my door. This time, when I opened it, my brother didn't try to walk past me. He stood there, hands visible, posture tight. Behind him, my parents lingered in the hallway. Close enough to hear, but far enough to pretend this wasn't happening. This has gone too far, he said, voice low. I tilted my head, slightly. You mean it's gone public? He flinched. You didn't have to do it like this. I stepped aside just enough to let him see the apartment. Not as an invitation, but as a boundary. I didn't do anything, I said. I stopped covering for you. My mother spoke then, her voice brittle. Families don't air things like this. I met her eyes. Families don't take credit for work they didn't do. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were sharp, but because they were simple. Unavoidable. My brother exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You always do this, he said. You make it dramatic. I laughed once, quietly, without humor. You made it dramatic when you stood up in that room and called my work yours. I just didn't interrupt. For a moment, no one spoke. The hallway light hummed softly overhead. Somewhere, a neighbor's door closed. Life, indifferent to our reckoning, continued. What do you want? My father asked finally. The question again. Always that question. As if dignity were a negotiation. I want my name back, I said. And I want distance. From all of this. My brother's face tightened. You think walking away makes you right? I smiled then, not because I was winning, but because I was done. No, I said. It makes me free. They left without another word. That night, I slept with the windows open, the city noise drifting in like proof that the world was bigger than the room I'd been shrinking myself to fit inside. The fallout didn't explode the way people imagine these things do. There were no dramatic resignations posted online. No public apologies written by consultants. Just quiet corrections. Meetings postponed. Invitations revised. Names added where they had been missing before. My brother's presentation was rescheduled indefinitely. My inbox filled with cautious messages from people who had watched silently for years and suddenly found their voices when it was safe to use them. One message stood out. It was from a junior analyst who had been in the room that day. I saw what happened, she wrote. I didn't say anything then. I just wanted you to know I noticed. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Sometimes, acknowledgement arrives late. It still counts. Weeks passed. The new office took shape slowly. Whiteboards went up. Desks arrived. The first contract was signed without fanfare. When people asked where I'd come from, I didn't tell them about the meeting or the betrayal or the silence that followed. I told them what I was building now. That was enough. I heard through the family grapevine that my brother was taking time, that he'd told people it was mutual, that he still didn't understand how it had slipped away from him so cleanly. I didn't correct the story. Let him have whatever version helped him sleep. One evening, as I was locking up the office, my phone buzzed with a notification from a platform I hadn't checked in months. A post had gone live, an industry feature highlighting emerging leaders in systems design. My photo sat there, calm and unposed, my name printed correctly beneath it. No mention of family, no borrowed credit, just the work. I closed the app and stood in the quiet hallway, keys cool in my palm. It struck me then that the moment I'd been waiting for, the apology, the recognition, the admission, had already passed without ceremony, and that I hadn't needed it after all. What I needed was distance, and truth, and the courage to let someone else sit in the discomfort I'd been absorbing for years. As I turned off the lights and stepped outside, the city air felt sharp and alive. Somewhere behind me, a door had closed. Somewhere ahead, another was already open. And just before I drove away, my phone vibrated one last time. One message, no name, no words, just a notification that someone new had requested access to a file I never meant them to see. Before you click away, take a second to let this story sit with you. If you've ever been overlooked, spoken over, or had your effort claimed by someone else, you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Your voice matters more than you think. And if stories like this resonate with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.